Shalom and welcome to Shikul Da'at. I'm Rabbi Josh Rose. I want to offer just a very brief reflection on this week's Torah portion. And I want to do it by starting a little bit towards the climax of the Torah portion, which is where Joseph finally reveals himself to his brothers. He's been concealing his true identity and seemingly kind of playing out a manipulative scheme in which he literally and figuratively brings them to their knees. They are there to beg for food from the second in command to Pharaoh, who, unbeknownst to them, is actually their brother Joseph. He is aware what they did to him all those years ago, and he is aware of how much his father is currently suffering, thinking that he, that is Joseph, had died, as the brothers told it, having been eaten by a wild animal. So Joseph is aware of everything that is happening, and the brothers don't see him because he is concealed by disguises. So much of Joseph's story is about disguise and about being hidden and then having that hiddenness undone. So, for example, in a moment that I'll come back to shortly, at the beginning of the Joseph story, that's back in Parshat Vayigash, we know that his father famously gives him this beautiful tunic, whether it's a striped tunic or a colored tunic or a technicolored dream coat. We don't know for sure, but something that is a sign of his father's favoritism. And that gets stripped from him as he's thrown into the pit by his brothers. And then, once he's taken down to Egypt, again, he's dressed up. He's risen to a position of prominence as the sort of the household servant to Potiphar. And then that garment gets stripped from him, and then he winds up kind of naked in a prison. And then as he emerges out of the prison, once having demonstrated his brilliance and his resilience, and he comes up with a plan to save Egypt from famine, and he rises literally and figuratively in prominence. He's lifted up out of the dungeon that he's in and brought back up to Pharaoh. With these increasing ascents, his position also raises up, and he's dressed up in the garb of an Egyptian official. And as I said, he becomes now second in command to Pharaoh, and he's dressed like an Egyptian. And so his brothers do not recognize who this man is who stands before them. And all of this artifice, all of this hiddenness, and all of this disguise falls apart as Joseph is finally overcome with emotion, as his brothers seem to have done proper teshuvah, that is, they seem to truly regret what they had done to him, and they truly seem to have become new people because they're doing anything they can, as in his brother Judah's moving speech, to avoid making their father Jacob suffer again. And it seems that when they once cavalierly took their father's favorite son Joseph and disposed of him like a piece of garbage, now that act seems unthinkable to them as they beg the Egyptian official, that is their brother Judah, to not force their father to go through further suffering by holding one of the brothers prisoner, that is Benjamin, prisoner. And so there's been, it seems, a complete transformation of the brothers, but also I want to suggest a total transformation of Joseph, which really should grab our attention. If we go back to that moment in Parshat Vayigash, the rabbis, we look at Joseph through the lens of the rabbis, we really can see the sense of transformation, spiritual growth and transformation that he goes through. Because early in the Joseph story, in the Parshat Vayigash, he's an easy figure to dislike. He comes across, even in the Peshat of the Torah, as a little bit of a spoiled brat. He is his father's favorite, and he has these dreams in which he kind of proudly presents to his brothers that in these two different dreams he has, that all of the brothers and their father bowed down to him. And even Jacob, with his kind of sagely position within the family, and of course he's one of the patriarchs, so with his own spiritual insight, even he questions Joseph's choice to not only to have these dreams, but to share the choice to share the dreams with everybody. And the rabbis pick up on the way in which Joseph sort of seems lost in himself and his own image of himself. And there is a midrash that tells us that when Joseph was a little boy, he used to stand in front of the mirror, and, well, it's actually not clear exactly how young he was, but stand in the mirror and dress himself up and kind of admire his own beauty. And that, you take that stark rabbinic image and you put it together with his dreams. In his dreams, the brothers and his father are bowing down to him. And if we take those two images, we see that Joseph's world early in his story is constructed like all of ours is early in our lives, with ourselves at the center. Now, what's interesting is that Joseph's dreams turn out to be prophetic, because in fact the brothers do eventually come to him and they bow to him, again not realizing that it is their brother, because they're begging for food from this Egyptian official who seems to hold the key to their survival. But what I want to focus on now is that in the dreams, they are bowing to him. And as I said, that is prophetic, but the image is powerful because we also get caught up in ourselves. And before we fully understand ourselves, and before we fully understand the world, and before we fully have an inkling of what it is, the governing force of the universe, that is of God's presence in the universe, it seems to us that the world happens to us and that the world circles around us. And for sure, children in the clearest way have the sense that the entire world is happening to them, and that it is centered on them. And though we largely grow out of that naivete, we do moment to moment move through the world with the sense that we alone are experience the suffering and the difficulties of the world, and we get into this place of ego self-centeredness where we view everything that is happening as something that's happening to us, for good or for bad. It's happening to us, and that's where Joseph is early in his life. And that rabbinic image, the midrashic image of Joseph standing gazing in the mirror at his own physical beauty, I think really symbolizes that. And then in our Torah portion, in this week's beautiful Torah portion of Vayigash, when he is finally overcome, and the verb is lahitapek, he can no longer keep up appearances, and it's like he falls apart, and all of this false construction falls apart. Why? As he says to his brother, he now understands that everything that has happened, even this plan that he was in a very manipulative way causing his brothers to jump through these hoops, whether it was to torture them or whether it was to give them the opportunity to do teshuva, he now understands that everything has happened because of God's will. And suddenly it's not Joseph at the center, it's God at the center. And fascinatingly, another of the intriguing aspects of the Joseph story is God's relative absence throughout the entire Joseph narrative. God is there, but very much in the background, whereas in the lives of the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, God is very much part of the story and speaking to the patriarchs and engaging them in covenants and giving them instructions. And that finally does happen as Jacob finally has a conversation with God as after Jacob has been summoned to come down to Egypt to meet to be reunited with his son. God engages Jacob and tells him not to fear going down into Egypt. But up until this point, God has really been in the background until the speech where Joseph comes to the realization that all of this is the divine will. And Joseph, in that sense, brings God into the surface of the conversation, revealing not only God's presence moment to moment in the background, even when we can't see God, and therefore affirming that there's a larger order in the world, but also demonstrating his own self-transformation, that he understands that, yes, he does have a singularly important role to play, but that role is not about having Joseph at the center. It's about being an agent of God and God's will on earth. And for that, we require tremendous humility, and we take ourselves out of the center and then ask the question, how can I be of service? So I just want to offer that teaching and suggest that in that in Joseph's own trajectory is a teaching about the trajectory that we have to follow and continue to move through life, diminishing our ego, self-centered view of ourselves and of the world. And in so doing, we can make space for something else, for a larger purpose, a larger meaning of our lives, and ask the question, what is it that God demands of us to heal the world, to bring God's blessing into the world? How do I diminish myself so I can ask that question instead of questions about how can I benefit? How can my life become better? How can my life flourish? How can what I want to happen finally unfold? Our truest blessing, the truest fulfillment of our wishes, is when we finally diminish our ego enough to ask those larger questions about God's presence in our lives. And of course, and I'll close on this, that Joseph's story is one that's paradigmatic for the Jewish people, and that idea is woven together so beautifully and powerfully with the narrative that brings Joseph and his brothers, now all of the tribes are now in the land of Egypt, and the stage is set now finally for the book of Exodus, which we'll begin reading, in which the Jewish people, the people Israel, follow the trajectory of Joseph down into Egypt, down into a place of darkness. And remember that Joseph has suffered for years, and yet within the context of that darkness, they too will be fruitful and multiply as Joseph did. And as Joseph had children and established a family, so too will Jewish life continue, but under very difficult, agonizing circumstances. And they too will have to eventually discover the presence of God in their own lives, and that presence becomes the redemptive force that allows them to free themselves from Egypt, just as Joseph freed himself from his own illusion that he was at the center and that there was no larger meaning of God in his life. So with that, may we all draw on the wisdom and the energy of Joseph drawing God down into the world. Shabbat Shalom. Thank you so much.